A great boss fight is defined by 6 different key things. They're very simple things, stuff that most people would probably take for granted in most games, but they're extremely important. A lot of it is the sort of stuff that, when done right, doesn't even really stand out to you as impressive. It's just to be expected from any game worth playing. There's 6 keys to a great boss fight, so let's unlock the door to the first one. It's the gameplay. Duh, H2, gameplay is important in a video game, thanks for reminding me, I didn't realise. Yeah, I know, it seems obvious, but think about it for a second. The way in which you defeat a boss is very important to how fun they are to fight. Let's take a bit more of a boring example. A boss like Robot Sandy from Battle for Bikini Bottom is quite mundane. She has a small number of attacks, you just run away from her, and she'll eventually show you a weak point, and when you hit the weak point, she takes damage. Rinse and repeat until she dies. There's nothing particularly wrong with this boss, but it's not too engaging either. Yes, you're right, I am picking apart a children's game for having boring boss design, sue me. A boss fight with much more engaging combat would be something like the Dancer of the Boreal Valley from Dark Souls 3. Yes, I did just compare a children's game with SpongeBob in it to Dark Souls. Sue me. In fact, basically every boss from Dark Souls can fit this description. Their attacks dance across the screen, and the player has to dodge the attack accordingly and then get a few hits in before going back to being defensive. Some bosses will take more damage if you hit them in a weak spot that's hard to reach, forcing the player to strategically position themselves around the fight, maybe take some risks to get extra damage in. The visual design of the boss also comes into play here. Telegraph animations, the animation that displays to let you know that the boss is about to attack and what that attack will be, massively dictate the pace and difficulty of a fight. If a telegraph animation is short, the attack is harder to see coming and therefore harder to dodge. Longer telegraph animations can make it easier to see coming, but can be compensated for by the attack covering more of the screen. Bosses will have fast attacks, slow attacks, big attacks, small attacks, and the player's ability to act accordingly in each situation is what allows them to succeed against the boss. This fight is significantly more engaging than just waiting for a weak spot to appear on your screen and then jumping into it. The gameplay should force the player into thinking about what's going to happen next, to cleverly using their abilities to defeat the big bad guy, and if they don't think cleverly or quickly enough, they should lose. Which brings me on to my next key to a great boss fight. Challenge. If you don't play the game well enough, you should lose. When I say challenge, I don't necessarily mean that a good boss fight has to be hard. No, challenge does not mean higher difficulty. It just means that you have to actually overcome the boss to continue forward. A boss that's too easy is legitimately a roadblock to a fun game. Bosses that appear earlier on in the game can and will be easier than later bosses, but they should still be a challenge relative to where you're at in the game. A player fighting the Dung Defender on their 8th hour of Hollow Knight should find him just as difficult as they found Hornet on their 2nd hour. This fight is much easier than this fight, but this fight takes place while the player has much less experience of the game and its mechanics, so the level of challenge that the player is experiencing is equal, even if one boss is harder than the other. This of course won't translate very well into subsequent playthroughs of a game, but it will make each and every boss feel just as engaging as the last, and make each and every boss just as memorable too. Without any challenge, the bosses don't leave an impact on a player. I don't remember a boss if it didn't kick my ass a few times, and that's extremely important. And whilst they're kicking my ass, they should at least have the courtesy to play me some good music while they do it. The soundtrack is an interesting key to a boss fight, because a half-decent soundtrack will just be background music to the gameplay. It'll just sit there and go mostly unnoticed, other than maybe 1 or 2 key scenes. But an incredible soundtrack leaves you completely lost for words. Of course, my number 1 example of this is Mithrix from Risk of Rain 2, because Risk of Rain 2 has the best soundtrack any piece of media has ever produced. And it's not even close. But there's other great examples too. I know that this has become a meme now for some reason, but there's a reason that Megalovania is still iconic and recognisable 6 years later. And I hate to bring up Dark Souls for a second time in the same video, but an incredible example of awesome boss music is this. Gwyn's fight has an incredible score, not just because of the music itself, but also because of how it defies expectations. Every other piece of music in Dark Souls is huge, bombastic, orchestral music blaring in your ears the whole time about how menacing the dude you're fighting is. But for Gwyn, the big bad final boss of the entire game, nothing but piano and the sound of a fiery blade swinging in your direction. Incredible. But if the bosses are gonna sound great, well, they should probably look great too. Oh dear god. A boss fight needs to send a message just by looking at it. It needs to be menacing. It should be terrifying. If those adjectives don't fit your game's theme or art style, then make them charming, or funny, or cute, or just make them stand out from the crowd somehow. Bosses like Flowey from Undertale and the Moon Lord from Terraria always stuck out to me at being excellent at this sort of thing. We just witnessed a bit of the chaos of Flowey, but the Moon Lord is just as good. A chat log tells you that impending doom approaches. The screen begins to blur and flicker, anticipating his arrival. Then he appears with a flash of bright light covering your screen. He blackens the sky, and holy hell, look at the state of him. He looks and behaves nothing like any of the other bosses in the entire game, and it makes him much more memorable than any other boss too. But something that Terraria lacks that other boss fights don't is the build-up.
Fine. My turn.
A great villain's backstory does a great job of selling a boss fight. They're introduced early and built up as this menacing villain that will murder you instantly. They spend the whole game taunting you. They do everything they can to get in your way, and by the time you reach the end of the game, well, it's just you and them. The build-up is the next key, and my absolute favourite example of this is GLaDOS from Portal.
Hello!
Oh, it's you.
You know her?
It's been a long time.
At first, she is just the robotic voice on a speaker talking you through the test chambers.
We hope your brief detention in the relaxation vault has been a pleasant one.
But she gradually drops hints of a plot to kill you throughout the game. When you eventually escape the test chambers and her plot to burn you alive, she desperately tries to convince you to come back. Then you eventually find her chamber, and you see this strange, almost eerie looking metallic thing hanging from the ceiling. She taunts you some more, and then tries to poison you with deadly neurotoxin. Just think about it. Without the build-up throughout the entire game, this moment that you finally stumble upon her wouldn't be nearly as impactful. The same goes for Portal 2. You know what happened in Portal 1, and Wheatley tells you about how crazy she was when she was active, even makes a big deal of walking through her chamber. So when you finally awaken her, that big reveal is even more of a shock than before. Wheatley himself also takes a leaf out of the GLaDOS book. After he takes his turn to the dark side, he begins taunting you much like GLaDOS used to, but in a much more incompetent tone than she did, which makes the moment that he tries to kill you just that much more impactful.
Hello! This is the part where I kill you!
So that's gameplay, challenge, soundtrack, aesthetic, and build-up out of the way. We have just one more left to cover, and that's individuality. Individuality can come in tons of different forms, and a bunch of the bosses we've already mentioned have this feature in droves. In fact, individuality can be down to gameplay, challenge, soundtrack, aesthetic, or build-up all combined. But when it comes to individuality, it needs to do one or more of those things in a unique way that might catch the player off guard. Maybe the boss has a unique mechanic that differs from everything else the game has to offer. Maybe it looks like a complete and utter abomination. What the f***? Whatever it may be, individuality can make a boss so much more memorable than they would be otherwise. How many bosses look like this? How many bosses have fights that go like this? Not that many, which makes them just that much more memorable than any other counterpart that they might have. as 6 keys to a great boss fight. I would argue that a boss fight needs to do at least 4 of these well for it to be a good boss fight, and one of those 4 has to be gameplay. Without gameplay, the boss almost certainly sucks. A boss that does 5 is even better, and a boss that does all 6, well, that boss is a masterpiece. So with all that being said and done, it should now be much easier to distinguish the good boss fights from the bad boss fights. Try to be a little bit less like this, and a bit more like this. Thanks for watching.